The last perspective that we will take a look at in sociology today is the symbolic interactionist, or otherwise known as just the interactionist perspective. And the interactionist perspective is uh, quite simple, I guess, compared to the functionalist and the conflict perspective that we just took a look at in two other videos. Um, with the functionalist and the conflict perspective, you can actually look at society as a big picture. You can kind of talk about things in a major perspective, things that are going on in society. And I actually uh, referred to various pictures that you could think about when you talk about the conflict or the functionalist perspective. Well, I'm not going to do that with the interactionist, because the interactionist, it basically doesn't have a grand theory of society. It doesn't say, well, society acts this way or that way, and this is how we're going to interpret everything. Instead, it tries to put meaning into society by looking at various symbols that we use within society. For example, years ago, I had a foreign exchange student from Germany. And I remember at the very end of the semester, I was talking to this young lady, and I asked her, what were the things that most surprised her about our culture versus what she had grown up with in Germany. And one of the things that she mentioned was how she couldn't believe how many times that she saw the American flag. She said in every classroom she went into, there was the American flag. When the school day started, we said the Pledge of Allegiance. Every single athletic event, we played the national anthem, things of this nature. And it's because in our society, the flag represents patriotism, nationalism, and those are things that we tend to value in our culture. In Germany, they don't have that. She said, you don't see the flag everywhere you go. You don't play the national anthem. She said she may go through an entire year and only hear the national anthem 2 or 3 times. Because if you think back in Germany, the flag and extreme patriotism and nationalism got Germany into trouble. They basically created situations around World War I and World War II where that was not a good thing. It didn't work out very well for Germany. And because of that, their culture does not really promote extreme patriotism or nationalism. And so when we talk about different symbols within society, you have to think about there is a social construction of reality. In other words, each culture or each society kind of helps to define how we view various things within society. For example, let's take the family as a social unit. In some cultures, marriage is arranged by parents, and it's more of a kind of an economic institution. Families will determine, if it's economically viable for two particular people to get married, and if it would benefit both families, and so on. And so then that marriage is kind of arranged with the idea that this is going to benefit them. And love is not the number one factor in a marriage. The idea there is that once the couple get married, well, then they will eventually learn to love one another. Now, in our culture, it's different. Okay, most people in our culture would not envision getting married to someone that they did not love. But if you think about it, love is an emotion. And when we talk about basically making a long-term committed relationship type decision that could last us 30, 40, 50, 60 years of our lifetime based on an emotional feeling, that's a very difficult thing to think about or to do. And that's why a lot of times, um, sociologists will tell you that in the family situation today, in America anyway, that a lot of times people get to the point where once that initial emotion of love kind of evaporates or it kind of goes away, in other words, the honeymoon's over, so to speak, well, then a lot of times we tend to look at our marital mate, whether it be the husband or the wife, and we tend to find fault. We tend to blame them that, oh goodness, they're not providing us with the emotional support that we needed, that we had at the beginning of the marriage, and that sort of thing, and that creates an issue. And then today, if you compare today's marriages and families with families of 100 to 200 years ago, we don't have nearly as many children. If you think back, for example, to the early 1800s, we had over 8 children per family. Nowadays, the number of children per family is about 1.7. So less than 2 children per family in America today. Well, that creates another issue because instead of having all of those people who could provide, for example, emotional support for the different members of the family, you don't have that. You don't have that number of people that you can count on. There's a very limited number of people involved in the family. Then you add the change in the way that we treat children today. For example, years ago, once children got to be about 10 to 12 years old, they were considered essentially a miniature adult. And we taught them, how to act as an adult, and they were given adult responsibilities, and boom, they were kind of out of the nest, so to speak, at a very young age. Now we have kind of created this whole idea of adolescence and the idea that children should remain at home, continued being nurtured, and so forth up until maybe the late teens to the early 20s. And so now we've put even more burden on mom and dad. So you not only have husbands and wives who are struggling because the emotion that was there when they got married kind of fades over time, but then you have the added responsibility of nurturing and caring for the children over a longer time period, that all of a sudden people get involved in a marriage. And after so many years, they start thinking, okay, they're kind of getting beat down. They're getting overloaded with the responsibilities that they have in the marriage, and they're not getting the emotional results out of the marriage that they thought they would get years ago. So again, it's kind of a situation where it almost makes it easier for people to choose divorce as a possible outcome of that marriage. And so if you look at divorce in our culture, divorce has actually changed over time. And whereas years ago, back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, divorce was kind of a hush-hush thing. Nobody wanted to get a divorce. It was socially unacceptable to divorce. Now, all of a sudden, the game has changed, and divorce does not hold the negative stigma that it once did. So many more people are apt to take that avenue, and it's kind of changed. That whole idea of divorce has changed symbolically within our culture. The social construction of divorce has changed. So the thing to remember about the Interactionist is that it does help us to, this perspective helps us to analyze kind of where we're at in culture and where we're at in society today, and to evaluate um, things that are going on in our lives. Now, does it give us a grand theory of, society? No, it doesn't. But it does help us to understand the things that are going on around us today. Okay, so that's kind of a totally different approach than the conflict and the functionalist perspectives.